Up is Patrice Clarke. Patrice is an MPhil student at the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies. She is doing work that looks at the writing of deaf students, interferences from English, and other factors. So she's going to be presenting today on tense and aspect in narrative writing of deaf students.
Okay, so today's talk, I'm going to be looking better. Okay. So the topic of today's presentation is tense and aspect in the narratives of deaf students. And let us begin. So my thesis examines the sample narratives written by deaf students in Jamaica. And for this presentation, I'm using a subset of the samples used in the thesis and focusing specifically on the verb phrase. So the aim of the presentation is to determine the frequency of the lexical verbs used by students in the narrative and to find out how tense and aspect are marked by the students when they construct verbal phrases, and to determine if the productions are target or non-target in relation to English, which is the target language, and also to look at verb, preposition, and preposition combinations because of phrasal verb, or the presence of phrasal verb. So the linguistic situation that I'm examining, the students acquire their first language at school in most instances, and their first language is a visual gestural language, a national sign language called Jamaican Sign Language, and the deaf learners in Jamaica, because of delayed entry to school, oftentimes do not actually are exposed to other deaf learners, and so they have delayed language acquisition, which in effect causes language developmental delays also. So the second language that they are asked to learn, assuming that their first language is Jamaican Sign Language, is English, which they learn at school through formal education, because most times, depending on their degree of hearing loss, they are unable to actually access auditory input. So in Jamaica, deaf education is basically provided by the Jamaica Association for the Deaf and the Caribbean Christian Center for the Deaf. Those are the major providers of deaf education, and JAD provides deaf education using what they call a bilingual, bicultural approach, where they promote the use of sign language and try to use that as a medium to have their students acquire literacy in English. The issue is that most deaf students leaving the high school after, say, about 20 years are still unable to read beyond a grade 4 level, and somewhat are considered functional illiterates. They can't access post-secondary education and find it difficult sometimes to get jobs because they need English in order to actually function. Are you guys hearing me?
Yes. Yes.
I'm not sure. Right, so the difference with the first language and the second language, one is modality, and two, in the way that they're used. So Jamaican Sign Language is, I would like to think, synonymous with how hearing Jamaicans use Creole. It's a language of the community, it's a language of identity, and it has no agreed orthography if they have decided to fill one. And English is the language of instruction, the means through which you're educated, and the method through which all the texts are used. In the classroom, there are no there's no JSL curriculum at present, and all the materials are in English that they are expected to use to acquire English. So I call it an English only zone. Given all the languages in the contact situation, I have designed this diagram to basically summarize what I view to be the learner system which they use to produce these tests. So the three languages that are at the focal point are Jamaican Sign Language, Jamaican English, and Jamaican Creole. The white dots on the screen represent all the intermediate varieties that might be produced through contact with those languages. And the dot that says other represents the home sign or ASL if it is that the students were exposed to that. So I'm using this to say that the writing samples that would be examined are likely to show influence from all of the languages in contact depending on the student's hearing loss or their competence in English or their L1. So to talk about tense, tense basically is used to relate an action from the moment of speaking to some other point in time. And in English, it is conveyed using inflectional morphology. So the tense that we're going to focus on is the simple tense, simple present tense, and the simple past tense. And those are formed by basically adding S to the bare form of the verb in the case of the simple present and ED in the case of the simple past. Aspect talks a little bit more about action, but it doesn't relate in time. It's more habitual or something that's in progress, and that is marked by the ing or the ing being added to the verb. Can't see what I'm doing. So in JSL, expressing time is a bit different from how it's done in English or even in Creole where we have pre-verbal markers. In JSL, time is expressed using non-manual cues or in reference to what is considered a timeline. So the sinus body is basically a point of reference, that's your moment of speaking. Any sign away or in a forward position from the sinus body would be something for future events, and anything behind or back would be more in reference to past. So if there's an instance where there is no timeline communicated, the default interpretation is present. See that I can't sign those for them to see. So I looked at a study by Quigley and Hall, who examined deaf writers, Quigley in the US, Hall in Jamaica, and found that both of them surmised that auxiliary verbs, tense markers, copulars, and the verbal system on a whole was difficult for deaf learners. So the production don't often mirror what is expected from English because of the disparity with the languages, the difference between the grammatical system of the different languages. So for this presentation, I took 48 scripts, forgive my error, and then from 2 schools, and all the students were between 13 and 21 years of age. All the scripts were collected from the Jamaican Deaf Association. They had conducted a test of written language to assess the students' English competence, and they would have collected the data over the years, so I just sampled their database, basically. Having collected the data, I transcribed it and coded it using ANCONG and Clarke. So I wanted to use a corpus-driven approach to see what was happening there rather than make a list of problems that were there. These were the picture prompts used to elicit the data, and these were used between 2003 and 2015. I'm not sure if the students were timed. The exam itself asks that the students be given 15 minutes to write the essay, but I wasn't able to confirm through the association if they adhere to that requirement. So I wanted to find out, as I said before, how the simple present and past tense were formed, the progressive construction, as well as the alternate means through which they use to mark present and past tense in their writing. So I transcribed the text and I ran them through a concordance software called Ancom, and I basically used the root form of the word to determine the frequency or the most frequent words in the sample, and the most frequent word used besides the was the form of the verb to be, or its bare form. There weren't a lot of function words, so this represented perhaps 60% of the entire sample. There were 5,400 words overall in across the 48 scripts.
10 minutes.
Okay. So in the sample, I found that the students did mark the third person singular present as expected, but it was only a handful of students who were able to do that. And they did not have any over-regularization, you did not have any hypercorrection or any substitution in terms of, say, them using a process used by Jamaican Creole or Jamaican English or Jamaican Sign Language. What happened is that in cases where they did not use an inflectional morphology or form from English, the verb was bare. So there were over 700 bare verbs in comparison to what was marked for the present. The past tense was similar in that they produced very few past tense markers on the verbs, and the irregular forms were more frequently produced than the regular forms. There was hypercorrection with the past tense, so you would have had students producing things like told it, where told would have already been in the past tense, but they added an inflectional morphology just the same because they were produced in the past. For the collocates or the phrasal verbs, it had a lot of constructions with the preposition up. Some of them were acceptable in English, some of them were not acceptable in English, but it was interesting for me to see prepositions because most of the literature says the students often do not use preposition. So they did use it, but sometimes not as was expected, and sometimes they used it in ways that were acceptable. So of all the verbs produced in the sample I looked at, the students produced more forms of the verb to be than any other verb, and they used the modals in conjunction with infinitive forms as well as tense forms when they did use them. So they used them as was expected as a particle in say, forming the present continuous or the perfect tense. These were some examples that I took from it. These examples, in the case of reduplication, I felt looked at influence from sign language, but the reduplication here is what is called non-compound reduplication, where in the case of he, art, talk, a story, very lie, The child was really just adding intensity to say the extremity of the event. And in the case of father and mother drink water and quickly drive, that was more to produce a progressive rather than to augment or intensify the act itself. As mentioned before, there was over-organization, not just with the past tense, but also with the progressive form. And sometimes when the student produced the progressive form, it would be the verb, the copula, the form of the verb to be, but not in the form that was required by the subject to achieve agreement, or the verb to be itself was absent altogether, and you would just have the participle. So that was a general pattern right across the text. The man is tolling was the only instance I saw where they added ing to a root that could not take it and produce tolling, which I'm not quite sure how to interpret. And I had previously mentioned the toaded example. Thank you.
So the floor is open for questions now.
So, hi Patrice, thanks for that.
Almost got away.
All right, so I noticed on the list that you had for the simple past tense that one of the sentences was evil kill happened car accident weird. So when you were counting the past tense occurrences and looking at them, you didn't take into account overall grammaticality of the utterance?
No, I did not take into account grammaticality. I had only checked to see if the construction met the requirement. So if you had the marker required for that. If it is that I was confused about the utterance, the meaning of the utterance, then I went there. But because there was also something to look at, target and non-target like construction, I couldn't evaluate it without first saying that they used the marker.
Okay, so it's the use of the marker regardless of the appropriateness of the use of the marker then? No. Yeah, okay, well, that's it.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening. I was saying that I looked at the use of the marker first because there were instances where they used the marker, but it wasn't actually expressing power, in some cases possessive, etc. So I counted for them. I tallied the markers first and then tried to determine what the intent was. So some of what you're seeing in the examples might have been disregarded when I did the final count. I didn't do male and female had no difference in terms of performance. What caused the difference was really age, and because across grade levels you had an overlap in age, I didn't use it because then I'd have to map each error pattern to the age rather than the grade.
Okay.
So in a grade 7 class, the age range was 13 to 17. So I couldn't say grade 7 was doing X because it would depend on the age of that person that was assigned a grade 7 class.
So the students are batched based on the level they have acquired, not on biological age.
I'm using chronological age. I can't talk about what the grade, because the grade is something that the teachers put in this. And it's subjective because you can be 20 and be in a grade 9 class. So I didn't want to group them by grade. Gender had no bearing on whether or not they got anything, because boys and girls made the same mistakes and there were more girls than boys, so it was already skewed.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Professor Emeritus at Stanford University. His area is psychology and figures, and is one of those interesting people that Professor Devonish has been collaborating with over a long time. And I'll tell you a little story while we wait. That Professor Thomas is the numbers man.
I'm glad you clarified what figures mean.
Is the numbers man. So into numbers that it dazzles linguists, people who deal mostly with words. And I'm saying that because both him and Devonish had submitted a joint chapter to the book, the first book that I edited, co-edited with Lars Hinrichs. And I remember I thought it was a fascinating paper. I didn't understand what was going on in it. It was fascinating. But I understood enough to know that it would have moved our understanding of variation and the Creole continuum forward. But the editors of the volume thought it was too technical. The editors for the series thought it would have been too technical for linguists. I should have pointed out to them that Hubert Devonish is a linguist and was able to decipher all of that. So that's the history. I think that's the first time I got introduced to Professor Thomas.
Never heard that story.
Oh, no. Yes. So it has been a long, very long collaboration. So
It's always nice to come back here. I was here first. As an undergraduate in 1960. So it's always nice to come back. The plains are not as pretty as they used to be in those days. There used to be ample space for maneuvering at night, but now it's all buildings. And it's also good to see old friends. Umar Davies took time out from his busy schedule. Not as busy now as it was in 1995 when you were minister I think it was, everybody knew you ran the country in those days. Anyhow, so it's good to be back. So thanks very much, Joseph, for having me. Creole linguistics is one of Hubert Devonish's interests. In fact, it was one of the 11 interests shown on the call for papers that Joseph sent us. I don't know if you could find it on that list, but it's actually there. It's the last item on the list. And it may be the least, but it is the topic that we'll be discussing today. It's also a reminder that this year is the 50th anniversary of a seminal conference in Creole linguistics held right here at Mona. And one of the reference in Hubert's and my work is a paper in that conference by De Camp, and I'll get to it. The work itself started when I was here on sabbatical in 1995. I was a visiting professor of mathematics. I'd met Hubert a couple of years before at Stanford, and so he started coming to my office in the math department once a week. I think it was a Thursday, and we would talk. He had data. I'm a statistician by training. I've always been housed in psychology departments, but it doesn't change the genetic preference. I'm a statistician. And so I want to talk about that joint work we started in 1995. Some of it was published 10 years ago at a conference. The topic is the allowability of sentences in the Guyanese Creole speech community. So consider a sentence, I am reading. It has two slots. The first one is the first person singular, which is either pronounced I or me. And the second one is the post-verbal, the continuative progressive marker, which could either be rendered as ing or pre-verbal as a. So the versions would be, I am reading, and I'm giving you, just to anticipate the notation I'll be using, round brackets, and then inside the variants coded either as E for English or C for Creole. So the first sentence is English subject I, English verb I'm reading. The second one is me reading. The third, I read. And the fourth is me read. Me read is acceptable, allowable. It's pure Creole. I am reading is pure English. It's acceptable. So that's one of the constraints we'll allow, that all pure sentences are allowable. The issue is what mixed sentences are also allowable. And in the case of Guyanese Creole, Hubert and I would agree. We don't agree on everything, because I'm from Berbice, and he is from, I want to say Georgetown, but it's really outskirts of Georgetown. Anyhow, but we agree on this one, that that third one is the one that wouldn't be, right? I mean, you guys would feel free to agree, because there's a subjectivity in here that I don't think Hubert allowed when we first started talking, but still. So we're going to have those constraints. All pure sentences are allowable. The issue is going to be the mixed sentences. So when Hubert came into my office, he said to me, you know, constraints mean one thing to a mathematician, it means something else to a linguist. So we had to discuss what he means by constraints. So he said, look, if there were no constraints, then you got n slots in general. I just showed you n equals 2. And you could put an E or a C in either slot. So how many combinations? 2 to the n. But clearly that's too many. No language would, no speech community would tolerate that amount of variation. So that's what is meant by conjectures. There's something going on that constrains some sentences to be viewed as acceptable or allowable, and others aren't. So then Hubert said, you know something, man? The number of allowable sentences, if you got n slots, is n plus 1. I looked at him and I laughed. I said, man, that can't be true. Things like that just ain't true in life, you know. Because in the first place, he and I, we agree on a lot of things, but we didn't agree on every single sentence. So, but it took not a lot of time to realize that what you need to do is to have a stochastic or a probabilistic version of this rule. Don't tell me the number of sentences. Say something like the average number of sentences, and then I could accept it. So that's how we're going to view it, this kind of probabilistic view. So what Hubert was saying is that there was a regularity. Now, mathematicians, they start to drool when you see a regularity, because you can write it down, an equals n plus 1. So now the question becomes, what sort of mechanisms could generate this regularity? Turns out, of course, that this n plus 1 rule was introduced at this conference, the seminal conference 50 years ago, by Decamp in a model he presented called implicational scales. And Decamp, got to this rule by constraining a particular aspect of the situation. If you take the slots and ask, what are the Creole variants? So you got me, Arid. You can order them according to DeCamp on the basis of their relative Creoleness. That's the implicational scale. It turns out that once you do that, you could then order the sentences, the mixed and the pure sentences, with respect to their Creoleness. So this implicational scale, it does two things. It orders variants or words like me and Ari, these Creole variants, and then it orders people, because the person generating a sentence could be put on the same scale. So it's a really attractive model. And I still find it attractive, even if linguists don't like it. You know, it's really, and I think it's a generative kind of model. Everybody should know it, even if you have reasons to depart from it. Now, the question is, we have a regularity, and I know that I had some skepticism. A lot of people might have some skepticism. Is this regularity really true? And is it the only regularity? If it's not true, maybe there's some other regularity. So that there's a set of questions concerning the regularity. And then we have DeCamp. DeCamp has this beautiful model, remains beautiful despite heavy criticisms. In particular, people say there isn't any continuum. There's no unidimensional continuum. And if you want to get traction, at least you got to have a multidimensional continuum, maybe. So there's a whole lot of discussion about the assumption of a continuum. So the first thing I said was, well, what about if you don't assume a continuum? Could you then find another kind of model without a continuum that could account for the n+1 rule? Then would this other approach account for alternatives? If you don't like the n+1 rule, if you give me evidence that is not true, maybe this other framework that I've developed without a continuum, we've developed, might explain other kinds of regularities. And then there's a set of questions about what is the right interpretation of A sub n. A sub n is the number of allowable sentences of length n. Is that the same as the number of language varieties? And at this point, I'll need a lot of wisdom of the linguistic variety to answer. So what I felt was needed is what I'll call a general framework. You know, when a mathematician uses that word, you got to watch it. There are always cons and pros. The con is that you have to simplify to keep the problem tracked. 10 minutes? Well, all right. Let me speed up. So, first simplification. Every variable could either be English or Creole. Now, I sit down here yesterday, and I hear about you could be Creole from the west of Jamaica, or you could be Creole from the east, and I start to despair because I have a simple model. So you got to bear with me, okay? It might be that variables are ternary, and you can have a C1, a C2, and so on. The focus is going to be on the number. Give me a sentence of length n, count the number of English variants, and that's all I want to know. Length of the sentence and the number of English variants. And the focus is on the sentence, not a corpus, even though that's what I eventually would like to go to. And I'm not going to assume that Creole variants are ordered, and in that sense, this is going to be a general approach. So, notation, S for sentence or string, length n, and in any string, E is the number of English variants. M is going to be the average number of n strings, which is a string of length n, with E, little e, English variants. And then if you want the average number of n strings, you just add up all of the m n sub e for E less than, for E going from 0 to n. So that's just some notation. The approach is going to be, consider how you get a sentence of length n+1 from a sentence of length n. So take a sentence, I am reading, of length 2. To get a sentence of length 3, you could say I'm reading something, the books. You could say the books or the book them. You could say, instead of I am reading, I was reading. So you introduce a past tense. This has 3 slots, and so on. And then these are allowable. Let's say you start with an allowable 2-sentence. And how do you proceed to get an allowable 3-sentence? Some of them are allowable, and some of them are not. Another way of presenting this, what I call an extensional approach. Here's an end sentence. Put an n+1 slot. And the question is, if this is allowable, what's the chance that this one is allowable? This slot could be filled by an E or by a C, and the probability of allowable, I'm going to write this P sub E and P sub C. And so this general approach boils down to specifying 2 functions, PE and PC. It'll have parameters, it'll have a functional form, and so on. Here's another way of presenting this extensional approach. I want to end up with a sentence of length n+1 from a sentence that is allowable of length n. So I want to end up n+1 length with E a variance. Well, there are only 2 ways of doing it, and this what simplifies the problem. I could start with a sentence of length n with E variance and add a C. So it doesn't change E, but it changes the length. So I can get here starting with n and E and adding C, or starting with n and E minus 1 and add an E. So there are 2 ways of getting n+1 to n+1. There's a certain number of transitions here denoted by M, and notice the subscripts n and E. Here it's n and E minus 1. Then there's a probability that each of these is going to be allowable. You multiply number by probability, and you get an average number. There are 2 sources. You add them up, and this is the recurrence relation. You can do this thing iteratively. You can get the number of n+1 of length n+1 with E variance from the number. If you know Mn, you can know Mn plus 1. So that's the way we proceed. And the problem is to specify these functions P. Well, you want the functions to have some desirable properties. So if you add an E to a pure Creole string, you don't want the probability of allowable to be 0, because then you would never get mixing. So if you start with a pure Creole and you add an E, there must be some chance that you'll get an allowable string, and that's what is going to allow for E and C mixing. So this point here can't be down here 0. So this is a parameter. I'm going to call it compatibility, thanks, because what it is the probability that E and C go together. They're compatible. They can co-occur. So that's why I use the word compatible. And then if you have a string of length n and E, all of them is a pure English string, and you add an English variant, you're going to still have an allowable thing. So this probability, when E is n, must be 1. So these functions must all have this property. So you got to get from here to here, and you can clearly do it in a lot of ways. The easiest way is to draw a straight line, but here are some other ways of doing it. So I'm going to show you the results of these 2 models, the straight line and this one, which is interesting. Let me point out the difference here. This probability is minimal for most of the region, and then it jumps up. And it's going to allow for some interesting results. All right, so that's the strategy then. Here are the results. The linear model, the straight line. Here is, in the solid curve, the n+1 rule. You can get to the n+1 rule in this general framework by specifying the P's to be linear and to set the compatibility parameters equal to 1. If you change the parameter from a 1 to something less than 1, this is not an n+1 rule. If you make it 1.2, this is not an n+1 rule. So the n+1 rule exists on a sort of knife edge. If you move off of the knife edge, you don't get n+1. in this sense, then, this is not a logical argument. This is a kind of aesthetic argument. If I tell you that something only happens when P is 1, and P could be any number, you got to say that this something that you're seeing is rare. So I want to kind of wave my hands and say, M+1 rule, if it ever is true, you got to be a rare phenomenon. It's not a stable state of nature. Here's what happens when you use that nonlinear version, the one that stays low and then just jumps up. This one here, this first line, I'm plotting it on a log curve. So this one here is the maximal rule. But apart from that, once the compatibility is not too high, you get this up, it goes up and then comes back down. And I've done simulations, it always comes down to 2. So with this second model, you get this limiting case that the number of allowable sentences as n becomes large, that number tends to 2. And here again you get excited because you then say, well, this is a nice result. It must have some meaning in reality. What could be a meaning? Well, suppose I say, what I mean by a speech sample being allowable is that it's a very long sentence. And if you would allow me to make that stretch, then I would say this model predicts that as long as the compatibility of English and Creole is not so high, you can only get 2 language varieties. I probably have about a minute left, so let me wind up. This is an approach that I would jump into just because I like this kind of thing. And I noticed that noting yesterday, my friend Hubert was portrayed, correctly so, not only as a scholar, but as an activist. So I'm here to tell you that he's also a bit of a nerd. And this is the nerdy side coming out. Okay? You don't want, just a bit of a nerd. All right. Maybe I'll pull him more in my direction. So if your interest is in fine-grained linguistic effects, not like whether the first slot is a noun or a verb or the phonological context, this is what linguists are interested in, then I don't really have anything to say to you. But if, as sometimes yesterday you showed, you were interested in coarse ideas, not fine-grained, and things like lexical overlap, number of language varieties, English-Creole compatibility, these are this is the level at which this kind of modeling, I think, has some use. So what we have here is a framework for accounting for a range of regularities. The N+1 rule is 1, but there may be some other things like the number of varieties tending to 2. And so you don't need a different theoretical framework for every different data regularity. And this, therefore, is something I like, an economy, therefore, of theories. And then there's a lot of work to be done. What does a linear thing mean? What do these compatibility parameters mean? My kind of guiding principle is that a good theory is a really useful thing. And so people must like theory because it helps you in practice to make decisions. And even though I can't tell you how it was applicable to a lot of the things from yesterday, I just felt that there were things like when somebody put up a list of the languages with some heritage languages, you know, I'm thinking, is AN 2, does AN tend to 2 or 3 or 4? So I'm trying to see how the theory is relevant, but clearly this is the point at which I wanted to call Hubert and ask him what I should put on this slide, but then I was severely constrained. This is a surprise, so I couldn't call. So all I could, so I made up this last slide. I really don't have anything to say on this slide. My time is up, and my content is up as well. But I can say that it is a lot of fun doing interdisciplinary research, and I really want to thank Hubert for dragging me along this road. It's been a pleasure, both getting to know you and getting to know you in the last 2 days. I'm really impressed by the value you've added to people's lives and the value you've added to the discipline of linguistics. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I was going to, that's just so with the phone call, the response, when you call me now, on that you couldn't call, the call that you couldn't make.
Okay.
Right?
So you're assuming I've just called you?
Yeah.
All right.
And
So
it
you're
says-
in the response.
It says simple, right? If it is that it's not the N+1 rule, and that the probability of getting a non-matching item, right, or non-matching variant, right, is less than generated by the N+1 rule. Basically, we have a situation where two language varieties, the English and Jamaican, don't mix, or English and Guyanese in this particular case, can't mix, because essentially that anything other than the N+1 rule, right, lower than that, right, is going to mean two language varieties that do not mix. Okay? Because remember how the graph go. After a
Right.
while, it come back.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Because in the end, they're gonna stay separate.
Yes.
If on the other hand, it generates more than the N+1, what you basically are moving, you remember it go up high, to
Yes.
an infinite, everything becomes allowable.
Yes.
So it's either, so what's happening is the N+1 is the nice in-between that says you can mix but not too much. But if you allow for more mixing than the N+1 rule generates, you end up with an infinite,
Right.
a
Gotcha.
total free mixture,
Gotcha.
right?
Right.
And at that point, you don't have language varieties anymore, because anything is sayable.
Right.
So how to have your cake and eat it
Right.
is in that nice in-between where you have two language varieties and an allowed mixture in between. So it allows for them to stay separate and still intact. Anything lower than that means that they stay separate with no interaction. Anything higher than that is that they mix totally and there's no distinction between English. It's just a mix of forms. So
I'm not ready to concede that, because I could imagine that there are stable solutions with 3 and 4 and 5. It's just that I can't see it theoretically. You got to do it by calculations.
Well, what happened? The answer I give you is, well, I gave you 25 years ago when you sent me that same graph. So I just walk in from memory. All right?
But Hubert, isn't the N+1 rule too constraining?
You have, give me an example of, but only in the sense that when we, under the words advice, I then didn't just use my intuition, but we ran an experiment. And what we found out was that the N+1 rule was, in terms of we phoned and gave them all the possible sentences. Now, what we found was not that it was full 100% agreement.
But it was, on the average, it was true.
But on average, basically, when you looked at the average number of responses for each one of them, it conformed to the N+1 rule. It wasn't like you could get. Some people will accept IRE, some Chinese will, but very few. So that in the end, what was generated was a probabilistic version of the N+1 rule rather than absolute.
But it's still the case that n was less than 9, and you got plenty values of n above 9. So we don't really know that the N+1 rule holds for all n.
You'll never be able to prove it because people can't talk an infinite long sentence. It's theoretically possible. They cannot.
Right, but maybe that's the way. What do we mean by a language variety? You see, we can't mean the number of sentences of length n. That is not the definition of language varieties. So then you got to ask how to use the model results to mimic this concept of number of language variety. And I'm saying one way is to say, imagine that a variety is a sentence of infinite length. And then you get 2 in this case. So, anyway,
So a quick question. So when you talked about slots, I was thinking syntactic slots, but then I realized you're not talking about syntactic
Nah,
slots.
just length.
Because you're, yeah, but even that's confusing because you have I am reading and you had that as 2 slots.
And
And then you have I
was
was reading as
3.
2 slots. And that became,
As 3 slots.
as 3 slots.
Yeah.
And that didn't make, that, so
Now you got to talk to you, boy. Don't talk to me.
hey, how is it that I am reading and I was reading are different number of slots? That's not possible.
As a non-linguistic oversimplified thing. It's just for things, right? You understand? But obviously I'm reading, it actually has 3 slots because of the I. The am, the versus 0, and then the it. But he kind of, but so you just simplify it for purposes of kind of making the point about how it works, right? But in the real model that we work with, it have all the sophistication that you're looking for, right?
So I had a question. So from the CAM's implicational scales, which contains binary values for all the things. I know when the examples are given, they generally use syntax. Although to get the continuum, the CAM is not using each binary value, but he's lining up all of the values and how individual speakers would produce them. I was wondering if it might not be useful to step away from syntax and use phonology instead. And not consonants, because they can't use consonants, but use vowels, since we can get a much wider range in vowel production. So if you want a continuum of varieties, it might be useful to focus on vowels instead of things where the number of values, at least in terms of just impressionistic, so tend to be constrained. Unless you look at the discourse level, there are only so many ways, syntactic arrangements that you're going to get, which is why you would get not a lot of variation that the model would seem to predict.
There's an infinite number of points between R and R, for example. So we're in right? So it becomes, obviously for something like this, the concept of the linguistic variable is what we're working with here, right? And the linguistic variable ultimately requires you to have members of, in other words, is this or that?
You can still get the members. You can still get the variants.
No, but here's what's going to happen. You're going to end up having to make arbitrary cuts.
That's about it,
right?
Yes.
And you run into the same kind of problems that you're criticizing us for. So it's best to work with stuff that you can. It's like it's best to research where they have life.
Yeah. Okay.
What was the last sentence?
So it's best to look where there's life.
Where is this guy? Yes.
Yes. But it has to be half a second.
Yes, so Professor Thomas, I really enjoyed the presentation. I must admit, I kind of checked out of mathematics when they introduced long division all the way back then. So I followed what I could. But so in terms of looking at the language varieties, right? Especially the confusion sometimes that the average Jamaican has, that what is the difference between English and Creole, and why is this one English but this sentence isn't? And I think for the average Jamaican, the inclusion of one Creole element, it's no longer English. So English is measured in terms of purity, but not patois. At least that is what I've seen people making judgments on.
Yes.
Now, is it possible that your theoretical model here could be used in that kind of way? So for example, persons who here at the university or wherever teach Jamaican Creole or Guyanese Creole, could it be used in a way to determine that this sentence is definitely a Creole sentence as opposed to a Creole sentence being influenced by English or having some English interference, and therefore the person who is marking it can decide that, oh, this sentence is not good, this paragraph or this essay is not a good example of Guyanese Creole or Jamaican Creole, based on what your model is presenting here.
We're not there yet, man.
Not
I
there
tell
yet?
you, we're not there yet. I left Guyana really in 1960. And so while I wanted to defer to Hubert, I realized that even if I had stayed in Guyana, my Creole it would have been a little different from his. I come from Berbice and he come from Georgetown. So I feel very unqualified to answer. But I'd give it a shot, Yeah. Yeah.
I guess the teaching of Creole language is so ubiquitous that you're going to be a body or an agency that determine that this passage that is written in Creole is not only grammatically correct, but it is in the proper register. This is not formal patois or formal Guyanese Creole.
Yes.
And imagining that theoretical models like these might be some kind of assessment tool.
Yeah, I believe so, I see the possibilities. Ian, you have a
That was only what I was trying to get to. But I felt that at the time I needed to come of these. Moving to Georgetown. And I needed to see how very struck I am by the quality of the argument. No, I think it happens.
You mean, I hope you mean high quality as opposed to...
That is mathematician, and the linguist is not good. But all of this, of course, assumes that you accept the Kafkian model.
Not the continuum part, no. Just the binary part, for simplicity, but not the fact that the Creole, not yet. I mean, I like the model, I think it's true, more or less,
But there's also the Anatolian treatment of the same issue.
Yeah.
Which my parents speak of further complication of the problem that you were not.
Yes.
So there is neither position
I know.
nor the mix.
Yes.
All right, thanks very much. Okay, so we have to move on. And finally, I can introduce somebody who I taught. Our next presenter, Ronald Francis, also a student of the St. Augustine campus of UWI. As I mentioned before, I taught him in undergrad, and he's now pursuing a PhD in linguistics and working on varieties from his native St. Lucia. The title of his presentation is Hole the Laptop, which is WHOLE, and he's looking on an analysis of spelling errors in the writing of St. Lucian students. You're a trained teacher, or just a teacher? You have taught.
You asking me?
Yes. Yes, Ronald. So he has taught before in the high school system, and that had triggered his interest. Some of the errors that he saw in his students' work, and so when he came to UWI, he thought that that was something he should pursue in order to provide a fix.
Turn your phone off as well.
All right, so you'll share your screen with us.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right, so we have two little issues there. The internet connection is being problematic, And also, I just realized that I forgot my charger at home, but Patrice is right there. So if my laptop cuts off, I will switch over to Pat's laptop, I think within a minute or so. Okay? I'm not sure again if you can hear me because the internet connection is very low. So can I get some kind of feedback just to confirm?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so again, my name is Ronald Francis. Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Farquharson. And just a small anecdote, since I really enjoyed the classes that he taught me in undergrad, was that I got 84 in one of his classes, and I really wanted 86 or 87 in order to get an A+. And I sent him an email saying, can we speak about my exam paper? And Joseph said 1 mark could have been negotiated, but not 2. And that was the end of that conversation. So that was I also want to say, give a word to Professor Devonish, who never taught me personally, but of course I've heard so many things about him, and I have read Language and Liberation, which is one of the most inspiring books, I think, for a young Caribbean linguist to read. So first, in the order of my presentation, I will talk about my PhD thesis on a whole, just a little bit about the rationale, the context, try to zoom in on my study a little bit, and then a little bit about spelling and some of my preliminary results, which are based on the smallest of the 12 schools that I'm looking at. And I will try to draw some conclusions within the time if I have enough to do so. People who have seen presentations I've done before have seen the first 10 slides a million times, which is that there's a general problem, I think, in the Caribbean region, which is having one official language in multilingual space. And St. Lucia falls squarely within that problem, which is that you have some people who are native speakers of St. Lucian French lexicon Creole, and also Vessel, which is vernacular English of St. Lucia, as it has been termed by Hazel Simmons MacDonald and Garrett and other people who have studied it. But the problem is that people who are native speakers of the minority language or the Creole languages, they have challenges because public institutions do not accommodate them. And people have done research in the health sector, the legal system, and in education in particular, where my research is coming in. And the problem is that these people are automatically excluded from these public institutions because they need some kind of help to navigate the system. Again, the linguistic situation in St. Lucia is that you have French lexicon Creole, or what we call Creole, St. Lucian Standard English, which isn't really a thing that has been documented or studied extensively, and then an English lexicon Creole that has been termed Vessel by some scholars and Slev by other scholars. Basically, what is considered St. Lucian Standard English is conventionally American and British English. It's accepted in the education system. As a teacher in high school, we accepted any form of British or American English, even though British English was preferred. And what Vessel is basically an area of contention as well. Some scholars say that it is re-lexified Creole and that it includes a lot of Atlantic Creole structures. Some people think that it is closer to English actually than French Creole. I will adopt the position that there are parts of Vessel that look like Creole, and in a way they are re-lexified Creole. I won't enter into that argument too much here because there isn't any time, but I elaborate on that in my thesis. And there are other parts of Vessel that look like English. So whatever is in the essay that is non-standard but looks more like English, bears greater semblance to English, I have considered a non-standard English form. And whatever can find direct translation into Creole, I have considered basically a re-lexified English form. And that is what I refer to in my essay as Vessel. I will talk a little bit about how I derived that a little bit later on. And I'm open to more of the multiple criticisms that I've received in this area. There are a few things that are exclusive to Vessel, and I discuss each one of them in turn as they come about. More on the problem, as I said, I was teaching at St. Joseph's Convent in St. Lucia, and it basically changed my life. I was marking Common Entrance, which is the entrance exam into secondary school. And I had major disagreements with the other examiners at the table that I was at on one of the for one of the years that I was working. And it was because of that I got inspired to do this research, to actually look at common entrance essays and try to determine the issues that students are having. Are they old? Are they new? And how do they affect placement into secondary school, and how the examiner, the person sitting at the table, perceives the student that is being examined at that point in time. And in doing the research, I found out naturally that these issues are not new. This is a policy document that was made in 1993. I must have been 5 or 6 at the time. But basically, it said that there's a need to recognize all languages in the society as equally valid, and to see multilingualism and multidialectalism as positive attributes. Linguists before me, of course, have said that West Indian learners of English with Creole or Creole-related backgrounds are not native speakers of English. I disagree slightly with this document, because I think that there are many people who have strong competence in English and in Creole, and we should work to bilingual competence, of course. But the fact is, the students who have strong competence in the Creole languages need some kind of assistance with in the education system. There is also a monolingual bias for speakers of English, which has led to the underutilization of multilingual resources in our society. And my favorite part of the paper, which said that much harm can be done or is done in education because of the incorrect diagnosis of the problem. And that is where my research comes in exactly, diagnosis. So I think before we talk about curricula or strategies for teaching or pedagogy, we need to find a way to determine whether or not a student has stronger competence in Creole in St. Lucia, or in English, or some kind of very lingual code switching prowess, which we have not done here too. And that's my research, I'm hoping, will become one of the foundational things in that regard. Of course, Carrington, who wrote the grammar of Creole, said that any scientific approach to teaching must be preceded by an analysis of Creole and what he called areas of interference, even though the term is not really popular in second language learning right now, between languages. And what he means by that is mother tongue influence, basically L1 or prior knowledge, what a student comes into the classroom with, and basically what kind of transfer happens between the L1 and the L2. And he spoke about the need to look at that in both speaking and writing, which is where I'm zoning in. But what that means is that we cannot just assume that every student that comes into the classroom is the same, but look at individual competence. What is his struggle? What is his L1? And what prior knowledge does this particular student have? And not assuming that one size fits all in terms of a teaching strategy for students. Because my research is focused on writing, just a few notes on writing here quickly from my favorite source in all of those I've used so far, which is Singer and Bashir, who said that writing is not a natural extension of speech, but it uses the same psychological domain as speech, which is the cognitive linguistic domain. We cannot divorce a learner's linguistic competence or prior knowledge from the writing process. It means that however a person speaks or whatever the person knows, that is what will appear on the paper. That means that in generating text, the writer must draw upon phonological, morphosyntactic, and lexiosemantic competence in order to formulate knowledge and ideas into linguistic units. So I'm not saying that every single thing that is done in speech can be done in writing. We know that that isn't true, but I'm saying that definitely what is on the paper, what we're marking for the exam, the essays that we are picking up for the students, they are a strong representation of a student's linguistic competence and whether or not a student has greater competence in Creole or in English. There are previous studies that looked at basically Creole interference or Creole influence in the writing of students. The two relevant to St. Lucia are divergent in their conclusion. So Wint and Gingell, who were two British teachers who did research in St. Lucia in 1994, said that previous research made the unwarranted assumption that because an error in writing could be attributed to Creole interference, then it must be attributed to Creole interference. So they basically said that Creole should take its place at the bottom of a long list of issues that students have in writing. Before them was Martha Isaac, who looked at secondary school students in 1989. And then she said that there was a gap in linguistic ability and comprehension due to faulty or incorrect structures and dialect interference. So she basically put Creole at the top of the list in terms of the struggles that students are having. Outside of St. Lucia, Lise Weiner did the same in Trinidad and agreed basically with Isaac. Again, Isaac, 1986, sorry, not 89. Winston Gingell in 1994. James did the same for Tobago, looking at verb structure, and drew a conclusion that was closer to Isaac. And Ad et al. Did a study in Dominica in 2004, and their conclusions were closer to Winch and Gingell, who did the study in St. Lucia in 1994. So there is no consensus really on the role of Creole in terms of how students perform academically in writing. My study starts off by identifying everything in the writing that I consider a non-standard form. So basically, if it isn't correct English based on the conventions that we have of English so far, I consider it a non-standard form. And then I proceed through three taxonomies, sorry, or basically long lists and categories based on verb form, syntactic structures, etc., to divide them into three separate groups. So non-Creole influence forms, that are things that are due basically to English complexity, what Brown calls mistakes, and what other people have called basically errors, what they have referred to as, the term is escaping me now, intrinsic errors, or errors that are due basically to English complexity. Then there are things I call Creole influence forms, which are things that I categorize as exclusively belonging to transfer from Creole or from the Creole language. A few of these features are shared, meaning it's impossible to distinguish between non-Creole or Creole influence forms. I refer to these as unattributed forms, but they are a very small group, and I discuss again each of them as I go along. My research is focused exclusively on the Creole influence forms, even though I mentioned the others, and the relationship between a high incidence of these forms and the academic grade. So that is
10
where my
minutes.
PhD is really centered. Was that, sorry?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? What? So, of course, I have looked at verb forms. I presented on verb forms, word choice errors, noun errors, and clause and phrase errors. But I was having a lot of issues with spelling errors, and that is what I looked at in preparation for today's presentation. And I basically took off spelling errors from one group and categorized them into non-Creole and Creole forms. And I will discuss the types of errors that I received. And I'm open, of course, to all types of feedback in that regard. I will just run through the method because I'm running out of time here. I basically use error analysis as my methodological framework. The steps were identified by Corder in 1984. So it's basically about the identification of errors, classifying these errors, stating relative frequency, and number 5, which is most important to me, the determination of the source of error, or basically whether or not it's due to transfer or just English complexity. I collected a large sample of data, which is 580 scripts in 2015, 580 scripts from the actual common entrance exam. I collected 12 schools in districts. They were randomly selected, districts all over St. Lucia, and it's a cross-section that represents the entire population, which is basically all primary schools. I'm looking at 20 scripts, which is a combination of scripts from 2 schools for this paper specifically. The basic unit of my analysis overall is a fully punctuated sentence, because punctuation is part of what I am testing. And I basically deem a sentence grammatically acceptable if it is superficially well-formed, that is grammatical, but acceptable if it is also contextually appropriate. So that's what I refer to as grammatical acceptability. If it is lacking grammaticality or acceptability, it becomes what is a non-standard form. At this point in time, the sentence is tested by my Creole influence structure taxonomy and some kind of direct translation. And if it matches any of these categories, then I consider it a Creole influence form. So in this case, you have the Creole influence form, the boy swing the bat, because you have a 0-marked non-stative verb there. If it does not meet any of these categories, then it is tested by the non-Creole influence form. And if it meets one criterion in that, for example, the boy swinged the bat, where you have the correct English form, but this is simply due to the fact that this is irregular in English and not necessarily Creole influence, then it becomes a non-Creole influence form. I do consider it shared, for example, if you get a form that belongs to both things. And if I cannot determine it, I put it, determine exactly where it came from, I put it in the non-Creole influence form category, just because I want to be very conservative about what I consider Creole influence in my work. All right, so spelling on a whole, and I'm rushing through a bit here, is that researchers are not really sure exactly the role of sound or how we speak in terms of reading and writing. So they have not determined the extent to which reading aloud is based on rule governed print to sound translation procedures, on its relationship to the mental lexicon. So we've gone back and forth in this area for a long time. The biggest study in this area is phoneme grapheme correspondences as cues for spelling improvement, which was done by the Department of Health and Education and Welfare in the United States in 1966. It's like 1,200 pages long, and I really have not finished it. But basically, they said that a lot of spelling issues are developmental and not necessarily due to anything outside of normal cognitive development. They highlighted the innate complexity of English. Of course, that is my emphasis. And two examples of that are X, for example, is two phonemes, right? So it's k and s, or the fact that English is quite opaque in terms of the relationship between graphemes and phonemes. So E, that sound has multiple spellings, for example. I think about 12 of them in the English language. So in terms of looking at the results, what I tried to do was divide the spelling errors that I was seeing into non-Creole influenced forms, and I looked at 4 types of errors. I didn't have time to elaborate on my full methodology, but I basically looked at addition of items, omission of items, misselection, and malformation. And what I found was that you often had addition. So for example, inserted spaces or extra letters. So afraid with an E, or began with an E, or a space inserted in outdated, for example. And these things are just due to English complexity. There is no Creole basis, at least based on my research so far, for explaining these errors. It's simply due to the fact that you have multiple graphemes or multiple forms of spelling one type of sound in English. You often had omission of letters and spaces as well. So for example, if I remove the E in before, it doesn't change the spelling whatsoever. Or just the letter I, for example, can also produce the sound E. So students will mistake what is happening and spell believe, for example, as just I. English has numerous, for example, double consonants, which are historical and have nothing whatsoever to do with pronunciation. And in words like carefully, for example, we have an example there, or words like a lot are often spelled without the space, even though the space is required. So there are a lot of things that are due to English complexity and have no, are not due to transfer of the Creole language. You also have misselection of items. So bullying, for example, the child is just not aware of spelling conventions of English, or report, because OU in the word pour, for example, has the same sound as as in report. I suppose you can make an argument about the lack of rhoticity, making that distinction. And one of my favorite examples, which is see here, as in laughed, for example. So the English inflectional morpheme, ED, is devoiced when it is attached to some sounds, and then voiced when it's attached to other sounds. So that because it is pronounced t, the child has actually spelled it as t. So again, this is due to English and the nature, the opaque nature of English, and not due to Creole influenced forms. But there are some things, one more note before I move on from this side. Sometimes there were multiple errors in the writing as well. So in raining, the student has over-included a letter there. The child has deleted the I after the A, but also added another letter. So sometimes there were multiple forms that were non-Creole influenced. These were few and far in between. Usually there was just one spelling error in each word. But of course, there are some things that we can classify as Creole influence or belonging to speech. And I see Patrice flashing me here that I have very little time left, about 5 minutes, but I should get through it. So one example is come and take, and you have the misspelling and this can be due to the pronunciation in St. Lucia, which is for example, or an, depending on the accent or where the person is from. And we can account for that through TD deletion or cluster reduction of homoorganic sounds or sounds of the same voicing and place of articulation in English. Also, St. Lucians pronounce TH or theta as F, for example, thing. This is also popular in, this also happens in Barbados, according to Peter Roberts. And because of that, the student has actually spelled it as thing, for example. Before a vowel, or and vowels, the vowel R before nasal sounds is often pronounced as the wedge. In the word dumb, for example, so instead of saying dam, or instead of saying hand, as in that trap vowel that we know from Wells, it is often pronounced as the wedge, which is and students, because of that, misspell ah before vowels and spell it as you. So we have an example here, which is I don't give a dumb instead of I don't give a damn. Right? So all of this is example of grapheme-phoneme correspondence, or the fact that the student is taking Creole influence in speech and it's reflecting in the writing. Also, we have here, when I look in the bush, because the upsilon or the sound that we have here, which is required here, as in words like good or in words like bush in English, in standard English, for example, is not part of St. Lucian speech. That you have a lack of differentiation between oo and and sometimes the wedge. So because of that, the student has selected a grapheme or double O, which more commonly represents the long oo tense vowel in that case. So we got a lot of that in the writing as well. So when I look in the bush instead of when I look in the bush, for example. And just to justify what I'm saying, I took some data from another paper and presentation that I had done, in which I showed that the vowels that are selected in St. Lucia do not match received pronunciation or General American, for example. So the kit vowel that you would get in General American, or that short capital I, is most often an E, or the trap vowel in American English, and sometimes in RP as well, is most often an A, but sometimes a wedge in St. Lucian English. And I even showed differentiation between Trinidadian English as well. And the foot vowel, for example, which is an upsilon in American and British English, is often a long U, that tense U sound with length in St. Lucian English. So it shows more of the phoneme influence. And then my absolute favorite error in all of my research here, which is homophone confusion resulting from phoneme influence. So here, because we have the same thing that we discussed earlier, which is deleting alveolar stops. Patrice is telling me time done, but I'm going to beg for 2 minutes or 3 minutes to finish, even though my time is finished. Because of that, you have stops deleted in word final position, very common for Creole languages and extremely common in St. Lucia. That inadvertently creates whole, and therefore in pronunciation creates a homophone, and the child has selected the wrong spelling because the homophone confusion has been created from the TD deletion. So that explains the error that is in the title of my presentation, where the child said, if the Ministry of Education will not let me use the laptop as I please, they can hold the laptop, meaning they can keep it. I do not want it. If they're going to put restrictions on the laptop, let them hold the laptop instead of hold the laptop. Spelling has implications for other things. I don't know why I labeled that example X there. But it has even implications for syntax, for example. So you have the omission of letter or letters, where it creates some kind of inflection in terms of, and the letter is part of the inflectional morphology of English. So a load of book instead of a load of books. And then we know, for example, it's well documented, Crowley and Holmes, Pidgin and Creole, even before I was born, spoke about the fact that Creole languages are not usually inflected to indicate number. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir when I say things like that. So plural inflectional markers of the lexifier language are typically eliminated from the morphology of Creole languages. So many students needed a laptop, that S is deleted, instead of many students needed a laptop, for example. So spelling even has implications for syntax. It has more implications for syntax here, for example, in terms of possession. So you have the omission of the apostrophe S, for example, the clitic apostrophe S. And we know that in Creole languages, what you do is that you juxtapose the possessor and the possessed in order to indicate possession. So her mother rule, so because she was still under her mother rule, she should have listened, or as soon as I arrived at Ray J house instead of Ray J's house, for example. So what I'm finding is that, again, in trying to investigate spelling, which is not the center of my research, but I'm seeing a lot of connections between spelling and phoneme influence, spelling and how students speak, and even spelling and syntax. So what is the conclusion of all of this? Well, on a whole for my research, just considering one school, for example, school A, which is the smallest one and has 10 pupils, it is that on one side, Creole transfer must always be considered, but it depends on the student. So one student from this school, 48% of the errors that he produced, well, he or she, because I don't know the gender of the student, I marked them as Creole influence errors, and this student received 16 out of 30 in the essay, for example. So the question must be asked whether or not this student is Creole dominant. On the other side, some students have difficulty with just English complexity. So this student received 8.5 out of 30 in the essay, but only 0.05% of the errors were Creole influenced. So it means that there is a need to consider whether or not a student walks into the classroom having difficulty with Creole transfer issues or just English complexity issues, and not making a curriculum that is one size fits all. That said, 80% of the spelling errors that I found so far from the two schools and the question were in fact non-Creole influence errors. So while these phoneme things that I discussed are exciting, they only form 20% of the errors that I'm seeing in the data that I've looked at so far for this presentation. But again, what that means is that I'm going to remove this thing here so you can see my conclusions. Right, what that means is that students need to be diagnosed, as I said in the beginning, before teaching begins. So we have to know what a student comes into the classroom with. From a pedagogical perspective, even 20% is too high to ignore, because it means that one student may have major issues with Creole as their first language and struggle in the classroom. And it also means that learner corpora, gathering large amounts of writing from students, is important for, I think, developing curricula that are appropriate for the St. Lucian context. The Ministry of Education in St. Lucia burns the 4,000 or so scripts that they receive from students every single year after the assessment period. And I had to beg and pull all kinds of strings just to get 600 scripts. So I'm saying if we get these essays and then we form a huge learner corpus and we're able to tag them and track the development and the issues that students are having, they can become very useful, I think, to developing pedagogical strategies and curricula that are better suited for our environment. And again, the goal should always be bilingual competence, not letting English be dominant and reign and feel like boss. We should not continue the hegemony, as Patrice is whispering to me there, of the of English that we are seeing in St. Lucia and other parts of the Caribbean right now. So I am done talking. Thank you very much. I am open to your questions.
Okay, thank you. We have 5 minutes for questions.
All right, so I was struck by the way in which Creole was referred to as a problem in the classroom, and the idea of, transfer from Creole as a challenge or a problem to be overcome. Right, so my take on that is this. If you have children in a classroom who speak a language that is completely unrelated to English, then you could say that any transfer from the first language into English, is a challenge. Okay, presents a challenge. But in the case where the first language of children is an English Creole and they already have a certain amount of vocabulary in common, would it not be fair to say that the children, in fact, have an advantage and that their first language is to be treated as a resource rather than to be defined as a problem, because transfer from the first language becomes an obstacle to learning the spelling of English, when in fact it could provide you with a starting point or a springboard?
Okay. Yeah. Hello?
You don't want
Can
to
everyone hear me?
Yes, you don't want to respond?
Okay, yes. Well, I absolutely agree that it's not a problem. I was quoting, and that's why I put the basically I copied directly from the report. I copied it and I put it on there. I was saying what was said by linguists before me. So I do not consider Creole a problem, for example. I come from a family where you have numerous Creole dominant speakers. For example, a lot of my grandparents and uncles, etc., have very limited competence, I would say, in St. Lucian Standard English, and we only speak Creole to each other. And my research is exactly about remedying this problem, from saying that a Creole dominant student is somehow deficient when he comes into the classroom. The problem is that within the education system in St. Lucia is that every student who walks into the classroom is treated as if he is an English speaker. He or she automatically has some competence in English. And I think we do not take time to actually figure out what the student's competence is. So my research is not all encompassing in that it can tell us everything about every student. But I think if we take writing samples from students and then we put it through a taxonomy like the one that I'm creating, we can then determine whether or not a student is Creole dominant, and then begin using the student's first language or prior knowledge as the basis of teaching English, so that English becomes a second language learning experience for that student, for example. So if my presentation gave the false impression that I see Creole as a problem, like I do not. I speak the language fluently. I absolutely love the language. I speak it with my family, etc. I just think that what we are doing in St. Lucia is wrong, which is treating every single student as an English speaker, for example. So and even though linguists before me who have done research in St. Lucia have said that some students are Creole dominant, no kind of test has been established to determine what a student's competence actually is. And I think the remedy to that, or one of the ways in which we can deal with that, is by looking at writing. So taking samples of the writing, for example, and trying to determine whether or not the structures in that piece of writing is closer to Creole, it looks more like Creole than it does English. And then we can determine whether the student is Creole dominant or perhaps is vessel dominant, as Hazel Simmons McDonald has suggested, or whether or not the student does in fact have strong competence in English before he or she comes into the classroom. So it's not a problem. My research is about diagnosis and moving from there, about categorizing so that we know which strategy is best, either L1 learning or L2 learning strategies for each student. I hope I answered Professor's question there.
Okay, yeah, she says yes. Am I correct that you equated ungrammatical with non-standard?
Beg pardon?
Am I correct that you equated ungrammatical with non-standard?
Ungrammatical with Creole?
No, no, no. When you were setting up your categories, you had a specific definition of an ungrammatical string. And then I think you said that those sentences which were deemed ungrammatical were classified as non-standard.
Right.
Oh, you want to stick with that?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I want to stick with that entirely. And I mean, you and I have had numerous conversations about terminology and getting it right. Because I'm using error analysis and working with mother tongue versus target language as my framework, I have started off by saying the essay in front of me, because when I received the essay, the common entrance essay, the student is attempting to produce English. So I have to consider that the target language, or what is expected by the examiner, is English. And because of that, I start off by saying that something in the writing does not look like standard English. And I create, and so I begin by saying it's a non-standard form. And the term itself, I accept that it may be problematic and it may put people on edge, etc. But what I'm trying to say, or at least what I'm trying to get at, is that some of these things that are being judged non-standard forms are actually standard or acceptable Creole forms.
Yes, but the fact remains that something is ungrammatical or that it's non-standard doesn't mean that it is necessarily ungrammatical.
Oh, I understand what you mean.
This is why you have to pay attention to terminology. Now, there's you can't treat English as a monolithic thing, even standard English, really. So you have to find better ways of talking about whether you use target, so it deviates from the expected target, if we even know what that target is, but not, because you have to remember that within the field, something being ungrammatical has a very technical meaning. And I'm sure that's not what you intend here.
No.
All right, we have to leave it there. But thank you very much. Thanks to you and Patrice.
Thank you. Right.
All right, so this is the lunch break.